The dust was a living thing, a pale phantom that smothered the sun and scoured the paint from the solitary clapboard house until it was the color of bone. It choked the brittle corn stalks and settled in a fine, gritty layer on the shoulders of the man who watched from the low rise. His name was Silas, though few who knew the name would speak it above a whisper. It was a name tied to smoke and cordite, to hastily dug graves on the high plains. He was just passing through, a ghost on a ghost-colored horse, seeking nothing more than the far side of this desolation. That's when he saw them. Two riders, broad-shouldered and swaggering even in the saddle, had cornered a woman by her well. A boy and a girl, no bigger than saplings, clung to her faded calico skirt. Silas was too far to hear the words, but he didn't need to. He knew the language of intimidation. It was a dialect he had spoken fluently for most of his life. The tilt of a head, the casual way one man rested a hand on the butt of his pistol, the woman's rigid posture, a fence post against a gale. He nudged his horse, a big roan named Dust, down the gentle slope. He made no effort to be quiet. The crunch of stone and dry earth under Dust's hooves was a warning he'd learned to send ahead of him. The two men turned, their conversation cut short. Their eyes took him in. The trail-worn clothes, the flat-brimmed hat pulled low, and the Colt peacemaker tied down low on his thigh. It was a uniform, and they knew its meaning. The woman, Alara, saw him too. Another threat. Her body went even stiffer, pulling her children tighter behind her, as if she could absorb them into herself. Silas dismounted, his movements economical and slow, his hands kept carefully away from his hip. The air grew thick, the silence broken only by the keening wind. "This ain't your concern, stranger," the taller of the two men said, his voice a gravelly sneer. He had the look of a man who enjoyed his work. Silas didn't answer. His gaze drifted from the man to the woman, and then to the two small heads peeking out from behind her legs. The little girl, her face smudged with dirt and tears, hid completely. But the boy, with wide, terrified eyes the color of a summer sky, stared right at him. He stared at the worn leather of the holster, at the polished walnut grip of the gun. His small chest hitched with a sob he was trying to swallow. Silas's presence had changed the equation. The two men exchanged a look. They were bullies, not fighters, at least not against a man who looked like he'd been forged in hell's own fire. The taller one spat a wad of tobacco juice near the woman's feet. "Thorne ain't gonna wait forever, missus. That signature is all that's keeping this place from being cleared." He threw a last, venomous glare at Silas. "You picked the wrong dog to back," he snarled, and with a final, ugly laugh, he and his partner mounted up and rode off, swallowed by the haze. For a long moment, nobody moved. The wind wrapped the woman's skirt around her legs. Her shoulders, which had been ramrod straight, began to tremble. Silas remained a statue of dust and leather, his expression unreadable. He was a problem that had solved another, and she didn't know what to do with him. It was the boy who broke the spell. He finally let go of his mother's dress and took one hesitant step forward. He was so small, the world so big and threatening around him. He looked up at Silas's grim face, at the weapon that hung by his side like a promise of violence. His voice was a tiny, wavering pipe against the vastness of the prairie. "Will you hurt Mama too?" The question struck Silas with the force of a physical blow. It was cleaner and sharper than any bullet he'd ever taken. He'd been called a killer, a devil, a demon. He'd been feared and hated. But he had never been looked at with such pure, unadulterated terror by something so innocent. In the boy's eyes, he was no different from the men who had just left. He was just another monster in a world full of them. Something inside him, a part he thought had died and turned to stone years ago, cracked. He looked from the boy's face to the mother's, saw the same fear mirrored there, warring with a desperate, defiant strength. He looked at the hardscrabble land, the failing well, the house that stood as a testament to a fight she was losing. And he made a choice. His voice, when it finally came, was rough from disuse, like stones grinding together. "No, kid," he said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "I won't." He took a slow, deliberate step back, raising his hands slightly to show they were empty. He looked at the woman. "I'm not them." He vowed it then, not to her, not to the boy, but to the ghost of the man he might have been. He would protect them. The dust swirled around his boots, sealing the silent oath. Alara watched him, her suspicion a shield she held between them. Gratitude was a luxury she couldn't afford, not yet. But the immediate threat had passed, and this man, this dangerous apparition, was the reason. She clutched her children's hands, their small fingers digging into her own. "The water in the bucket is fresh," she said, her voice tight but clear. It was all she could offer, a payment for a service she hadn't requested. Silas gave a curt nod. He walked to the well, his spurs leaving small, crescent-shaped marks in the dust. He drank deeply from the dipper, the cool water a balm on his parched throat. When he looked up, the woman and her children were gone. The cabin door shut firmly behind them. A thin line of smoke began to curl from the stone chimney. He was alone again, but the landscape felt different now. It was no longer just a place to pass through. It was a place with a line drawn in it, and he was standing on one side. He led Dust to the lean-to that served as a barn. It was meager, but it was shelter. He unsaddled the roan, rubbing the horse down with a practiced, soothing rhythm. The familiar movements calmed his own frayed nerves. That boy's question echoed in his mind, relentless. "Will you hurt Mama too?" He'd spent a decade making sure people knew he was capable of hurting anyone. Now, for the first time, he was desperate for someone to believe he wouldn't. As dusk bled purple and orange across the horizon, the cabin door creaked open. The woman, Alara, stood silhouetted against the lamplight. She held a tin plate. "It's not much," she said, her voice carrying on the cooling air. "Stew. There's a bench by the door." He walked over, taking the plate from her. Their fingers brushed, and she flinched, pulling back as if burned. He understood. He was a wolf she'd led into the yard to chase away other wolves. Now she had to sleep knowing he was there. "My thanks," he mumbled, retreating to the bench. The stew was thin, mostly potatoes and a few bits of salted pork, but it was hot. He ate slowly, watching the lights of the cabin. He could hear the faint murmur of her voice, singing a lullaby to her children. It was a sound from another life, a life he'd never known. He finished the stew and left the clean plate on the porch steps before retreating to the barn. He rolled out his bedroll in the hay, his saddle for a pillow. But sleep didn't come. He lay awake, a cold, heavy weight beside him, and listened to the sounds of the prairie and the quiet, breathing life of the house he had sworn to protect. The next morning, he was up before the sun, a habit ingrained from years on the run. He found the axe by the woodpile. It was old, the handle loose. He spent a few minutes tightening the wedge with a rock before he set to work. The rhythmic thud of the axe splitting dry pine was a solid, reassuring sound. He worked steadily, building a respectable stack of firewood. He was working when Alara emerged from the cabin, her children trailing behind her like ducklings. She stopped when she saw him, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. She hadn't expected him to still be there. She certainly hadn't expected him to be working. "You don't have to do that," she said, her arms crossed over her chest. "Handle was loose," Silas replied, not stopping. Axehead could have flown off. Hurt someone, he split another log with a clean, powerful stroke. He was telling her, in his own way, that he was thinking of her safety, of her children's. The boy, Leo, watched him, his fear from the day before replaced by a cautious curiosity. The little girl, Cora, hid behind her mother's skirt again. "I have coffee," Alara offered, after a moment. He finally stopped, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his sleeve. "Appreciate it." They drank the coffee in silence on the porch steps, a good 6 feet of space between them. He noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the raw, chapped skin of her hands. This land was taking everything from her, and still she fought. He respected that. He'd known men with half her grit who called themselves tough. "Jedediah Thorne wants this land," she said suddenly, staring out at the horizon. "The creek runs through it. Only reliable water for 10 miles. My husband, he wouldn't sell." Silas waited. He knew there was more. "He died 6 months ago. A hunting accident, they called it." Thrown from his horse, she said the words with a flat, bitter certainty that told him she didn't believe them for a second. "Thorne's been sending his men around ever since. Pressuring me. Trying to scare me off." "Why stay?" Silas asked, his voice low. Her chin came up. "Because it's ours. Because my Ben is buried on that hill over there. Because I will not let that man win by making me run. This is my home." Her defiance was as stark and beautiful as a desert flower blooming on barren rock. Silas felt that crack inside him widen. He was used to people running. It's what he did. But she stood her ground, armed with nothing but memory and a will of iron. He'll send them back, Silas said. It wasn't a question. I know. You and the kids can't face them alone. She finally turned to look at him, her gaze direct and searching. Are you offering to help, mister? She trailed off, realizing she didn't even know his name. Silas, he supplied. And I'm not offering. I'm staying. For a bit. He couldn't bring himself to say more, to explain the inexplicable pull he felt. He couldn't tell her about her son's question, so he made it practical. That fence by the north pasture is down, and your well pulley is about to give. I can fix things. It was a bargain. His labor and his gun in exchange for what? A bed in the hay? A plate of thin stew? No, it was more than that. It was a chance to be something other than a ghost. Alara hesitated for a long moment, weighing the danger of him against the certainty of Thorn. She looked at her children, who were now watching him openly. She saw the stack of firewood he'd already cut. She saw the way he held himself, a coiled stillness that was dangerous but not. She was starting to believe malicious. The barn is yours, she said, sealing the deal. I'll bring out meals. And so the days fell into a strange, new rhythm. Silas worked from sunup to sundown. He mended the fence with new posts he cut himself. He re-roped the well pulley and reinforced the barn door. He moved with a quiet competence that spoke of a life before the gun, a life where he'd learned to build things instead of tear them down. He rarely spoke, but his actions spoke for him. He was a guardian, a silent, watchful presence at the edge of their lives. Alara watched him from the cabin window as she kneaded dough or mended clothes. She saw the way he moved, the coiled power in his shoulders. She saw him pause in his work to watch a hawk circle in the sky. She saw him, when he thought no one was looking, gently stroke Dust's muzzle. He was a puzzle of contradictions, a killer who was painstakingly repairing her world. The children were the first to bridge the gap. Cora, the shy one, began leaving things for him on the porch rail. A smooth, gray stone, a brightly colored feather, a wilted wildflower. She would run and hide before he saw her, but he always found the small offerings. He started a collection on the windowsill in the barn. Leo was bolder. He began to follow Silas at a safe distance, watching him work. One afternoon, as Silas was sharpening the axe blade, Leo crept closer. Is your gun heavy? The boy asked. Silas didn't look up from his work with the whetstone. Heavy enough. Can you shoot a hawk from the sky? Wouldn't want to. They belong up there. My papa taught me how to whittle, Leo said, his voice softer now. Before the accident, Silas stopped his work. He looked at the boy, really looked at him. He saw the grief and the loneliness warring with the boundless energy of a 7-year-old. Silas reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small block of soft pine and his whittling knife. He didn't offer it to the boy. He just started to carve, the blade moving with a surprising deftness. He worked in silence, and Leo sat on the ground, cross-legged, and watched, mesmerized, as a rough shape began to emerge from the wood. It started to look like a bird. That evening, when Silas came to the porch for his dinner plate, he left the small, intricately carved wooden bird on the step. He was already back in the barn when he heard Cora's delighted squeal through the closed cabin door. A small, unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest. A week passed, then another. The fragile piece of their routine was shattered one afternoon by the arrival of a lone rider. It was Jedediah Thorne himself. He was a big man, florid and fleshy, dressed in clothes too fine for the dusty landscape. He sat on a magnificent black stallion, looking down on the small homestead, as if it were a bug he was contemplating squashing. Silas was repairing a harness near the barn. He didn't reach for his gun. He just stood up slowly, wiping his greasy hands on a rag, and waited. Alara came out onto the porch, a shotgun held loosely in her hands. Leo and Cora scurried behind her. Thorne's eyes, small and piggy, flickered from Alara to Silas. A smirk played on his lips. Well, Alara, looks like you've hired yourself some help. Or is it company you're keeping these days? His tone was thick with insinuation. State your business, Thorne, and get off my land, Alara said, her voice shaking but firm. Your land. Thorne chuckled, a low, ugly sound. We both know this land will be mine. It's just a matter of how much trouble you want to make for yourself before the inevitable, His gaze settled on Silas. I know you're kind. You drift in, take what you can from a lonely widow, and drift out again. I'll make you a better offer. $500. Cash. You ride out today and forget you ever saw this place. It was more money than Silas had seen in years. It was a ticket to anywhere. A new start. The old Silas, the ghost, would have taken it without a second thought. But the old Silas hadn't been asked if he was going to hurt a boy's mother. He hadn't been given wildflowers by a little girl. I like it here, Silas said, his voice flat and cold. The work is honest. Thorne's smirk vanished. You think you can stop me? I own this county. The sheriff, the judge, they're my men. You're just one man with one gun. One is sometimes enough, Silas replied, his eyes never leaving Thorne's. The threat hung in the air, palpable and deadly. Thorne stared at him, trying to find a crack, a weakness. He found none. He saw only a granite-hard certainty that unnerved him. With a curse, Thorne wrenched his horse's reins and galloped away, leaving a cloud of angry dust in his wake. The moment he was gone, Alara's strength seemed to desert her. She leaned against the porch post, the shotgun suddenly heavy. Leo ran to Silas's side. He didn't say anything. He just reached out and took Silas's calloused, greasy hand. The small gesture of trust was more powerful than Thorne's money, more binding than any contract. Silas looked down at the boy, then over at Alara, her face pale with fear and defiance. He knew then that he couldn't leave. He wouldn't. This was his fight now. That night, the conversation on the porch was different. The space between them seemed smaller. He won't stop, Alara whispered into the darkness. He'll be back. With more men. He'll burn us out. I know. Why are you doing this, Silas? He offered you money. You could be 100 miles from here by morning. Silas looked out at the stars, a cold, glittering canopy above them. He thought about how to explain it, how to put words to the change inside him. A long time ago, he began, his voice raspy. I was supposed to protect someone. A family. I was young, arrogant. I thought my gun could solve anything. I was wrong. I rode away when they needed me most. I wasn't there when the fire started. He fell silent, the memory a raw, open wound. He had never told anyone that. Alara didn't press him. She just sat there, her presence a quiet acknowledgement of his pain. My Ben, she said softly, he was a good man. A farmer. He wasn't a fighter. But he was stubborn. He believed in what was right. He believed this land was worth fighting for. Thorne's men ambushed him, made it look like an accident. The sheriff, he just filed the report and closed the case. They were two people, haunted by the past, facing a brutal future. But in sharing their stories, they had forged a new kind of alliance. It wasn't about work or protection anymore. It was about justice. It was about standing for the dead and defending the living. He wants to do this in the dark, Silas said, his mind working. On your land, where there are no witnesses. We can't let him. We have to take the fight to him. To the town. In the light. They won't listen to me, Alara said, despair creeping into her voice. They're all afraid of him. They might not listen to you, Silas agreed, turning to look at her, his eyes glinting in the moonlight. But they'll listen to me. The plan was simple, and it was desperate. The next day, Silas rode into the town of Redemption. It was a dusty, one-street town that lived in the shadow of Thorne's sprawling ranch. He hitched dust in front of the saloon and walked in. The place went quiet. Men stopped drinking, their eyes following the notorious stranger who had taken up residence at the widow's place. Silas ignored them. He walked to the bar and ordered a whiskey. He drank it slowly, letting the tension build. Then he turned to face the room. I hear Jedediah, Thorne is looking for hired guns, Silas said, his voice carrying to every corner. I'm here to offer my services. A murmur went through the room. Thorne's foreman, a hard-faced man named Calloway, was sitting at a corner table. He pushed his chair back and stood up. What kind of game are you playing? No game, Silas said calmly. But I don't work cheap. And I don't work for a man who sends lackeys to terrorize women and children. If Thorne wants to talk business, he can meet me here. At noon tomorrow. Alone. He finished his whiskey, slapped a coin on the bar, and walked out, leaving a stunned and silent saloon behind him. The gauntlet had been thrown. Back at the homestead, he told Alara what he had done, fear warred with a glimmer of hope in her eyes. It's a trap, Silas. He'll bring all his men. I know, he said. That's the point. I'm not going to fight them. You are. The next morning, Alara dressed in her Sunday best, a simple, dark blue dress she had worn to her husband's funeral. She braided Cora's hair and scrubbed Leo's face until it shone. She was terrified, but she moved with a resolute purpose. Silas saw the same iron will in her that he'd seen that first day. They rode into town in the wagon, Silas on dust beside them. They stopped not at the saloon, but in front of the sheriff's office. The whole town seemed to be holding its breath. People watched from windows and doorways. Noon was approaching. As predicted, Thorne didn't come alone. He rode down the middle of the street, flanked by a dozen men, Calloway beside him. They stopped 20 yards from the sheriff's office, a small army arrayed against one man, a woman, and 2 children. Thorne laughed, a booming, arrogant sound. So the great gunslinger hides behind a woman's skirts. I knew you were a coward. Silas didn't move. He didn't even look at Thorne. He looked at Alara. Now, he said softly. Alara took a deep breath. She stepped forward, her children holding her hands. She faced not Thorne, but the people of the town, the faces in the windows. My name is Alara Miller, she began, her voice trembling but carrying in the stillness. My husband was Ben Miller. This man, she said, pointing a shaking finger at Thorne, murdered him. A collective gasp went through the onlookers. He wanted our land, our water. Ben said no. So Thorne had his men ambush him. And Sheriff Brody, she said, turning to the portly man who had emerged from his office, sweating. You called it an accident. You knew. You all knew, and you did nothing. You let him threaten me. You let him terrorize my children. For what? For the scraps he throws you. Her voice grew stronger with every word, fueled by months of grief and rage. I will not be scared off my land. It was bought with my husband's sweat and paid for with his blood, and I will not sign it over to his killer. Thorne's face was purple with rage. Lies. She's a hysterical woman. Arrest her for slander, Sheriff. The sheriff looked from Thorne's furious face to Alara's resolute one. He saw the townspeople, their faces no longer fearful, but angry, shamed. Silas finally spoke, his voice cutting through the tension like a razor. I was there when your men threatened her, Calloway, he said, his eyes locking on the foreman. And I heard you brag in the saloon last night about how you handled her husband, about how a spooked horse can solve a lot of problems. Calloway went pale. He hadn't seen Silas in the saloon's dark corner. The tide had turned. The town was no longer afraid. It was watching. Thorne saw his power, built on fear and whispers, crumbling in the broad daylight. He was exposed. In a fit of pure, blind rage, he did the one thing that sealed his fate. He drew his gun. He was fast, but Silas was a part of the violence, an extension of it. His Colt seemed to leap into his hand. A single shot echoed down the street. It wasn't a killing shot. The bullet ripped Thorne's gun from his hand, sending it spinning into the dust. Thorne cried out, clutching his numbed, bleeding fingers. It was over. The image of invincibility was shattered. Calloway and the other men didn't move. They looked at their boss, a whimpering man in the dirt, and then at the silent, deadly gunslinger who hadn't even broken a sweat. Their loyalty was to power, and the power had just shifted. Sheriff Brody, finally spurred into action by the sight of Alara's courage and the town's accusing eyes, drew his own pistol. Jedediah Thorne, he said, his voice suddenly full of official bravado. You're under arrest for the murder of Ben Miller. As his deputies, emboldened, moved to take Thorne and a protesting Calloway into custody, the street remained quiet. The townsfolk slowly emerged, their expressions a mixture of awe and respect. They looked at Alara, not as a poor widow, but as a pillar of strength. They looked at Silas, not as a fearsome killer, but as a deliverer of justice. Silas holstered his weapon. The familiar weight felt different now. It had been used not for money or survival, but for something clean, something right. Without a word, he helped Alara and the children back into the wagon. He mounted Dust, and they began the slow journey home, leaving the town of Redemption to reckon with its own conscience. The silence in the wagon was not awkward or tense, but full of a deep, unspoken relief. The long shadow of Thorne was finally gone. They arrived back at the homestead as the sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of soft pink and gold. The little house no longer seemed so fragile. It looked like a fortress, a home. Silas began to unsaddle Dust, his movements slow, thoughtful. The job was done. The vow was fulfilled. The old instinct, the need to keep moving, to ride until his past was just a blur behind him, began to stir. He belonged on the road, not here. This place of family and fences was not for him. He finished with his horse and turned towards the cabin, intending to say his goodbyes. Alara was standing on the porch, watching him. Leo and Cora were beside her, holding the small wooden bird he had carved. They weren't afraid. They were just watching him. The creek will need to be undammed where Thorne's men blocked it, Alara said, her voice soft. It wasn't a demand. It was a statement of fact, a shared problem. Silas stopped. He looked at her, at the quiet strength in her eyes. He looked at the children, their faces full of a future he had helped secure. He looked at the small house, a beacon of warmth against the coming night. The wind whispered through the newly mended fence. The world was still a hard place, and the future was uncertain. But for the first time in a lifetime, Silas didn't feel the urge to run from it. He felt the urge to stay and face it. He walked past her into the small, clean cabin. On a peg by the door, he hung his gun belt. The heavy leather settled with a soft sigh, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, Silas felt a profound sense of peace. He turned back to her, a small, unpracticed smile touching his lips. "I'll see to it in the morning," he said. And in the warm lamplight of the cabin, he saw that he was finally home. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.